Yo, what's up? Hey, so today I want to talk about the yo, or the yarn over, and why this is an important element in your knitting. It can be used for design elements like with lace, or it can be used to make increases, because by creating a yarn over, you're adding an extra stitch on purpose or maybe not. So I'm going to talk today about why you might want to make a yarn over, how to do various types of yarn overs depending on the situation in your pattern, and also how to avoid the inadvertent yarn over, particularly when you're using magic loop, and how you can go back and add a yarn over if you missed one, or take one away if you accidentally put one where there shouldn't have been one. All right, let's investigate the yo. Okay, so what I'm working on here is just a simple garter stitch shawl, but it has some design elements that are big holes, and those are intentional. This is the Dot Rays shawl by Stephen West, and it has these various holes that are pretty large actually, and they're strategically placed in order to be like a ray, and they fan out from this center like this. So these are just very large yarn overs, and I'll show you how to accomplish that. So yarn overs can first and foremost, they can be a design element, as is the case here. All right, in this lace panel, this was part of the Inara wrap, the shawl knit along that we did several months ago. You can see that yarn overs are intentionally placed here in this pattern in order to do a lace design element. And this is just a series of yarn overs paired with decreases, because obviously every time you do a yarn over, you're adding a stitch. So if you needed to keep your same stitch count across all the chart repeats, you want to have the same count. And so the yarn overs are normally paired with a decrease, either a left leaning decrease, which would be a slip slip knit, or a right leaning decrease, which is usually a knit two together. And so yarn overs are a design element, obviously, in this case. I'm going to pause here for a moment to give a heartfelt thank you and a public shout out to 5 of my patrons who have pledged a monthly amount to financially support Purl Together, keep this channel going, and to keep these videos coming every single month. So a hearty thank you to Sheree Cox, Dorothy Freeman, Eleanor Fitzsimmons, Pamela Quillian, and Tina Jory. Thank you so much for your support. Okay, so let's go back to my garter stitch shawl just so that I can show you the way in which you want to do a yarn over. So when you're doing a regular yarn over in your pattern, you're coming from a knit stitch, as is in this case. If you're coming from a knit stitch, your yarn is coming from the back, and you're simply going to yarn over and around. You're just going to wrap counterclockwise in the same way that you would wrap your normal knitting, and then you would just carry on. And so what that does then is you have a knit stitch, a yarn over, which is a hole, but it looks like a regular knit stitch with the right leg in front, and then your next knit stitch. Okay, so let me take that back out and I'll show you again. So if you have knit one, yarn over, all I did was bring my yarn to the front and back around to the back. So I've just wrapped it around counterclockwise in the same way that we do when we're making a knit stitch, and then just carry on knitting. Okay, so that's a knit, yo, knit. Okay, so now let's say I want to go from a knit stitch to a purl stitch, and there's a yarn over in between. Well, normally you would come up and bring your yarn to the front and you'd go to your purl stitch. But if I do that, that's just a regular purl, and I won't have the knit or the yarn over in between. So I need to bring my yarn to the front and then go around again. That's going to create the yarn over, and you need your yarn in the front to do the next purl stitch. Okay, so let's take a look at that. I know that seems like an extra wrap, but really it isn't, because you can tell you have your that looks correct, doesn't it? Where you have the right leg in the front, and then you've gone to your purl stitch there. So I'll show you that one more time. So you have a knit stitch, and you're going into a purl stitch, so you're going to do your wrap just like normal, just knitting, wrapping around counterclockwise just like normal, but then you have to bring your yarn to the front to get ready for the purl stitch that comes next. Okay, so now if we're going from a purl stitch yarn over, you already have your yarn in the front, you can just lay it over and do your knit if that's what's next. See there? You don't have to wrap around again. Your yarns are already coming from the front, so you can just kind of lay it over and your yarn's in the back for your preparation for your knit stitch. All right. So let's see, what if we're going from a purl to a purl and we have a yarn over? So you're already in the front. You need to just wrap around one time so that your yarn's in the front again, and then just do your purl. Okay, pretty simple, and you can tell that that looks correct because the leg is forward on the right. Okay, so let's say one of my design elements is that I have to do a double yo. So that's what I ended up needing to do to create these larger holes in the shawl that I'm currently doing. So you'll knit along and then it says do a double yarn over. So that just means if this is one yarn over, you just wrap it again and that's your next. Sometimes you'll even have triple yarn overs. Now all that's going to do is when I come back through and knit this next time, it's just going to make a bigger hole because that's going to unwrap. I'm just going to do whatever it asks me to do. Here, I'll show you. I'll just turn my work and knit back into that and show you. So when I come back on the next row from my garter stitch, I come back and now I've got these two wraps and that looks really funny. I'm just going to just disregard the second wrap for a second. I'm just going to go into it like it tells me and I'm just going to slip the whole thing off. It just made a giant hole. That's all. Okay. So it just made a super big hole and that's just a design element in this particular pattern. Let's say you're going along and you realize you were supposed to have a yarn over down here and you didn't. And you know that that's part of the pattern, but you messed up and you didn't do it. How do you create a yarn over where there isn't one? Well, the easiest thing to do would be to just pick up this bar, this strand, and pick it up and then knit into that. And then you have a yarn over. Now that loop or that hole isn't going to be as big as a yarn over that you've created intentionally, but you might be able to stretch that out a little bit and fudge it. I do not recommend that. It's not ideal, but if you don't want to tink back, you might be able to, make a yarn over where you didn't have one before if you really, really wanted to. All right, another thing that sometimes happens, particularly with beginner knitters, is that they'll be going along and all of a sudden they'll end up with extra stitches that they didn't know they had. And sometimes they have an inadvertent or a yarn over that was not intentional. So how do you get rid of that? So you can see the hole right there and you can follow the columns up with the purl bumps and realize that this column goes with this stitch and this column goes with this stitch. And this is an accidental yarn over that really shouldn't be there. So how do we get rid of that? Well, what you could do is just simply let it go. Okay, there's not supposed to be a stitch there. Now that's going to make some tension issues there. You can kind of yank that up and kind of yank that up to even out those spaces. And that will help. And it will also help when you block, if you kind of mitigate that by, easing things, kind of massaging that back together. Okay, so now we don't have a hole there anymore, right? So you can take yarn overs out if you need to, if you can learn to read your knitting. Another time that it's really common to end up with mistaken or inadvertent yarn overs is when you're using your magic loop. And when you come to the junction where you need to shuffle around your magic loop and curl this to create your loop, when you start knitting, you need to make sure if you're coming from a knit stitch that your yarn's coming from the back. Now this is coming from a knit that was over the top of a yarn over, so it looks really loose and weird. But you have to make sure this is coming from the back if your next stitch on your new needle is a knit. If my working yarn is coming from the front and then I curl this around, and this is my half of my magic loop, and then I start knitting, well, look what's happened. I've already started with an extra yarn over inadvertently, and then I go start knitting and see there I've actually created a new stitch. I've created a yarn over accidentally by not making sure my yarn was coming off the back of my magic loop cable before I curled it around, and keeping that working yarn coming from the back. So you need to be mindful when you're doing magic loop with lace patterns or socks or anything else that you don't, make an extra mistaken yarn over. Aside from being decorative, yarn overs can be used for regular increases if you like. It's not my preferred way of doing an increase, but it can be helpful. A lot of people prefer them because they're easy. So you would just do a yarn over here if you wanted to do an increase on purpose, and you'd carry on. Now, When you come back, you'd want to close this hole. Unless it's a decorative element, you want to close that hole. And so I'll just turn this over and then show you how it would look when you go back. You'll want to knit into the back loop of that yarn over to twist the stitch and close the hole. Now, depending on your tension and how loose knitter you are, you may still have a hole, but if you knit into the back loop of that, it does twist the stitch. You can see how that twists it, and it does help to cover that hole. If you're knitting something in garter stitch, then see, it's barely recognizable, but there is a little bit of a hole there. That's not my preferred method of increasing, but it does work depending on your stitches and your tension and how you want things to look. You can get away with doing that, particularly with garter stitch and a shawl. You can do that. Now, another way that I've seen people do yarn over increases, in fact, I have a shawl pattern that indicates, is that you do the yarn over in the reverse way. So rather than wrapping the yarn over I'm just taking this out while I'm talking, but rather than wrapping the yarn over in the way that we normally would, wrapping your needle counterclockwise, you can introduce that twist right from the get-go by doing your yarn over. Rather than going this way like we normally would, you'd go clockwise and do your yarn over backwards to begin with. And then when you come back, you would just knit it the way that you normally would, because you've already done the twisting portion of closing that up, closing that hole. So when you get to the yarn over, you can tell that it looks like a backward stitch, doesn't it? And so you would just go ahead and knit that normally, and that's just twisting it the reverse way. So a yarn over can be a simple, easy way to do an increase if that's your method and your tension will allow and it doesn't create an unsightly hole, unless that's a design element that you choose. But it is a simple way to do an increase. And if you're increasing your total number of stitches, then you don't necessarily have to pair that with a following decrease as we would if we're knitting lace, keeping the same stitch count in our row. Often for a lace pattern, you would do your yarn over and then you would like slip knit the next stitch. So then you've got your increase, but then you have your decrease, and then you maintain that same stitch count. Okay, I hope you found those tips on the yo to be helpful and informative. If you like these videos, click the subscribe button and the little bell notification so you'll get an alert whenever we upload a new video. Check us out on patreon.com, and thanks for watching.